Happy Easter and happy Divine Mercy Sunday. I will be telling you a story, a true story. In mid-May 1945, the Allied armies marched into Holland and freed the Dutch from the grip of the Nazis. The Dutch people felt unspeakable joy. However, one Dutch woman was restless. Her name was Corrie ten Boom. During World War II, her deeply religious Christian family had helped hide 800 Jews. A secret room, no larger than a small clothes closet, was built into Corrie's bedroom behind a false wall. The space could hold up to 6 people, all of whom had to stand and be quiet and still. A crude ventilation system was installed to provide air. When security sweeps came through the neighborhood, a buzzer in the house would signal danger, allowing the refugees a little over 60 seconds to seek sanctuary in the hiding place. Some fugitives would stay only a few hours, while others would stay several days until another safe house could be located. However, late in the war, someone told the Gestapo and everyone was arrested. Her elderly father died in prison, and her sister, Betsy, died in the same concentration camp as Corrie. Her mother had died before the war. Corrie alone survived the horrors of Ravensbrück concentration camp. However, Corrie was restless. She felt God was calling her to bring healing out of the hurt. She also desperately missed her sister Betsy, who had died in the concentration camp. But now she remembered Betsy's words that they must tell others what they had learned. They had learned that healing was linked to forgiveness. That healing was linked to forgiveness. Corrie said, everyone had someone to forgive, whether it was a neighbor who had turned them into the Gestapo, or a vicious camp guard, or a brutal soldier. Thus began, for Corrie, more than 3 decades of travel around the world. She told people her story of God's forgiveness and the need for people to forgive those that had harmed them. However, in 1947, Corrie herself was put to the test. And here are the words of Corrie and what happened. It was in a church in Munich that I saw him, a balding, heavy-set man in a gray overcoat, a brown felt hat clutched between his hands. People were filing out of the basement room where I had just spoken, moving along the rows of wooden chairs to the door at the rear. It was 1947, and I had come from Holland to defeated Germany with the message that God forgives. It was the truth they needed most to hear in that bitter, bombed-out land, and I gave them my favorite mental picture. The sea is never far from the Dutch, and so I like to think that there is where our forgiven sins were thrown. When we confess our sins, I said, God casts them into the deepest ocean, gone forever. The solemn faces stared back at me, not quite daring to believe. There were never questions after a talk in Germany in 1947. People stood up in silence. In silence, they collected their wraps, and in silence, they left the room. And that's when I saw him, working his way forward against the others. The concentration camp came back with a rush. The huge room with its harsh overhead lights, the pathetic pile of dresses and shoes in the center of the floor, the shame of walking naked past this man. I could see my sister's frail form ahead of me, ribs sharp beneath the thin skin. Betsy, how thin you were. This man had been a guard at Ravensbrück concentration camp where we were sent. Now he was in front of me, hand thrust out. "A fine message, Fräulein. How good it is to know that, as you say, all our sins are at the bottom of the sea." And I, who had spoken so glibly of forgiveness, fumbled in my pocketbook rather than take his hand. He would not remember me, of course. How could he remember one prisoner among those thousands of women? But I remembered him. It was the first time since my release that I'd been face to face with one of my captors, and my blood seemed to freeze. "You mentioned Ravensbrück in your talk," he was saying. "I was a guard there. But since that time," he went on, "I've become a Christian. I know that God has forgiven me the cruel things that I did there, but I would like to hear it from your lips as well, Fräulein." Again, the hand came out. "Will you forgive me?" And I stood there, I whose sins had every day to be forgiven and could not. Betsy had died in that place. Could he erase her slow, terrible death simply for the asking? It could not have been many seconds that he stood there, hand held out, but to me it seemed hours as I wrestled with the most difficult thing I had ever had to do. For I had to do it, I knew that. The message that God forgives has a prior condition, that we forgive those who have injured us. "If you do not forgive others their trespasses," Jesus said, "neither will your Father in heaven forgive your trespasses." I knew it not only as a commandment of God, but as a daily experience. Since the end of the war, I had had a home in Holland for victims of Nazi brutality. And here's what she learned. Those who were able to forgive their former enemies were able to return to the outside world and rebuild their lives, no matter what physical scars. But those who nursed bitterness remained invalids. It was as simple and as horrible as that. And I stood there with the coldness clutching my heart. But forgiveness is not an emotion. I knew that too. Forgiveness is an act of the will. And the will can function regardless of the temperature of the heart. "Jesus, help me," I prayed silently. "I can lift my hand. I can do that much. You supply the feeling." And so woodenly, mechanically, I thrust my hand into the one outstretched to me. And as I did, an incredible thing took place. The current started in my shoulder, raced down my arm, sprang out into our joined hands, and then this healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. "I forgive you, brother," I cried with all my heart. For a long moment, we grasped each other's hands, the former guard and the former prisoner. I had never known God's love so intensely as I did then. This is divine mercy. This is the mercy that God offers all people. No sin is too great. Jesus did the same on the cross when he asked forgiveness for those who were killing him. The first Christian martyr, St. Stephen, said the same thing when he was being stoned to death. And the person that oversaw the stoning of St. Stephen, St. Paul, received that great divine mercy for his part in the killing and persecution of Christians. He went on to become the great preacher to the Gentiles. We here in this church today are the spiritual heirs 2,000 years ago or 2,000 years later to St. Paul's work among the Gentiles. because Gentile means non-Jew, and that is what we are. So how do we become conduits of God's divine mercy? What can we learn from the experience of Corrie ten Boom? I think there's 3 things that we can learn. First, to pray to God for strength to forgive. Second, that forgiveness is an act of the will. It is something we do. It is given to someone who does not deserve it. That's why it's called mercy. And if necessary, we can learn from Alcoholics Anonymous, where they have their statement, fake it to make it. And third, we need to be humble. Corrie recognized her own sinfulness in that moment and the need that she has to ask God for forgiveness every day. And so she knew she needed to forgive others in order to receive that forgiveness.